racism and sexual violence.
That microcosm of how we're being treated.
People weaponizing the anti-sexual violence movement
felt like a critical moment.
It's how we can integrate health equity into violence prevention.
Tear up the box.
We can make change.
Preventionists and people committed to advancing social justice coming together to make each other stronger. That's what Prevent Connect is all about. When you're tasked with creating a world free from violence, it can feel hard to measure any kind of progress. So often we operate in crisis mode, whether that's the crises we hold from survivors we work with, or the crises of our society and world that impact our work. Preventionists, or really anyone committed to advancing equity, are so busy reacting to the conditions that impact us, it can feel impossible to get enough space to see what's happening all around us. But that doesn't mean the work isn't happening. This year, Prevent Connect brought thousands of people together from across the country to share what's happening in their communities, from intentional approaches to anti-racism, to taking on housing, to looking at violence through a public health lens. Our movement is not backing down. For this episode of Prevent Connect, I connected with Ashleigh-Klein Jimenez and Shelby, two of my colleagues at Prevent Connect and Valor, to look back on some of the biggest moments for prevention in 2023. This is the first in a two-part series, taking a pause to look back on where we've been in order to commit to a path forward together. I'm Janae Sargent, and you're listening to Prevent Connect. Oh my gosh, Ashleigh, Shelby, welcome friends. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. How are you doing?
Good. Yeah, I'm doing well. I know it's so good to see you both. Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm like very motivated recently, just hearing about some really good calls from our grantees in California. So I'm so ready for this call.
Good. Oh, I love it. I say this in front of Ashleigh. I'm struggling with motivation these days, so please give me some of that energy.
Yeah, I can relate to both. To both of you, I feel like my days, they really vary. Sometimes I am so excited. I'm always excited, but other times, things feel a little heavy and hard. But I think for the most part, I am great today. I had some really good calls this week talking about exciting prevention stuff. So that always fills me up.
Oh, I love to hear it. Well, for people who are not watching this right now or listening to it as a podcast, I always say I'm so excited for all of our podcast guests. We get people from all over the field of prevention and sexual violence work. I'm especially excited today because you two are my dear friends and colleagues, and probably the most expert people that I know when it comes to sexual violence prevention. So I'm really stoked to be joined by Shelby and Ashleigh-Klein Jimenez. Shelby is the project coordinator for Valor and provides support to prevention programs across California that are hoping to advance equity and end violence through community and school-based prevention programming. As a preventionist herself, and Shelby and I go way back to our early days doing local prevention at different centers together, getting TA from Valor. As a preventionist herself, she's dedicated her career to looking at the intersections of violence from a public health approach to create safer communities across the globe. I will just say we're so lucky to have you, Shelby. And then Ashleigh, everybody knows Ashleigh. She's my occasional co-host on this podcast, the director of prevention for the state of California, leads Prevent Connect, as well as a ton of other amazing projects at Valor that I feel like people don't know that much about. You're like the busiest person I know, Ashleigh. So I'm really excited to have you both and your expertise here today. Can you believe that we are almost done with 2023? How bananas is that?
No, I can't believe it. I don't like to think about it, honestly. It just feels like the year flew by. We did a lot of things, learned a lot of things, but how is it already the end?
Oh my God, learned so many things. I definitely, that resonates with me. I feel like in this last year, not only just with our work and like how much I feel like we've grown in prevention over this last year and like the direction that it's going, which I'm excited to talk about today. But also just in general, I feel like I was a little sponge. I mean, after, the last few years kind of being kept away, I feel like I've learned so much in the last, I thought it was only 6 months, but yeah, it's been a full year.
Girl, it's been 11 months. We're 11 months right now. Well, you both said it, and it's true. This has been such a huge year for prevention. And I have to say, even though 11 months feels like 6 months, now is probably one of my favorite times of the year because we spend all this time putting stuff out, being a sponge, trying to keep up with all the trends. And this is kind of like the only time that I feel like I have to pause and look back and take stock of where we've been. Do you two feel as preventionists like you're pretty good at reflecting on the bigger picture when you're in the middle of the work?
I think I do. I feel like I'm very lucky to be able to provide support to such incredible folks in the field and on the ground doing this work that I feel like that helps keep me grounded in kind of the bigger picture because they all have their mindset on the bigger picture and these like systems change and policy changes and changing culture. And so it's helpful for me in my work to pull me out of kind of the day to day and focusing, mile by mile or every quarter mile at a day, whatever. Like it's easy for me to kind of go back to that because I have such great folks in California right now that really understand the bigger picture and are working towards that every day.
I really love that, Shelby. And I think that part of doing prevention and loving prevention is seeing the bigger picture, right? And kind of knowing that prevention is like a long game and that part of the reason why it can be so complex, or it is so complex, but even in just like how we talk about it and explain it to people is because it's like, I think of prevention as like an octopus with like 50,000 arms, little octopus arms. And I think like that's part of why I love it because I think that if we like a good solution, David always says this, a good solution solves many problems, right? And like, to me, that is so exciting. At the same time, in my experience, there have been plenty of times where things kind of like happen that we don't expect. Like I think about the Me Too movement. Unfortunately, I felt like we had to be very like reactionary to that, right? I don't know if we were able to really harness like that cultural moment in a way that like really shifted things for prevention specifically. So it's interesting because I think like a lot of times I do it really well. And then sometimes it's like, oh, wow, like this major thing happened that we really could have like used to our advantage and we weren't prepared.
You're listening to Prevent Connect, the podcast bringing together voices from across the movement to end gender and power-based violence, to give you the tools to practice primary prevention in your daily life and at work. We're highlighting emerging research, promising strategies, and stories from on-the-ground prevention practitioners doing this work in new and innovative ways. Bringing you topics like foundational strategies to prevent violence, primary prevention and youth engagement, critical race theory and school climates, prevention in a digital age, and more. I'm your host, Janae Sargent, and this is Prevent Connect. Prevention often feels like we're reacting to what's happening, like you're constantly trying to leverage what's going on around you, or if you're actually doing community-centered work, like respond to what's happening and support people as it happens. Sometimes I feel like I'm like a soccer goalie and I'm just like moving back and forth all the time. And so it can be hard for me. Like while I'm doing that, I'm constantly thinking about, okay, like what are we going to do now? What are we going to do now? How are we going to do this? That I don't always pause and look back. So I appreciate that you two see the bigger picture. I hope that I get a little bit of that from you today. And I'm really excited to be looking back on the year with both of you, because I feel like between the three of us, our whole thing is to try to keep our hands on the pulse of where prevention is going. You know, I mentioned this at the beginning of the podcast, but you both are probably some of the most plugged in people I know. And I know, like, behind the scenes, we're always going back to each other being like, do you have any resources on this? Or like, what do you know about school-based? What do you know about greening stuff? And I just like respect how much knowledge you bring to this field. I'd love to hear from you. Just kind of start it off. What are some of the big themes that you're seeing coming out of sexual violence prevention?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to, having like so much of my work focused in California, but also having kind of a role in my position working with a lot of folks across the country. A big thing that we're seeing is the health equity, as a process and as a strategy, but also as an outcome. Creating protective environments is a piece of that too. And that's kind of been a big shift that we've seen, not only from funders in California and from folks who are trying to implement the work from a kind of systemic standpoint, but also communities when they are responding to their community. Those are a lot of the common themes that are coming up, along with things like economic justice and restorative justice too.
Shelby, I love that you said as both a process and an outcome in terms of health equity and I think that, like, when we think about creating protective environments, we can't do that if there are health inequities. So they really, to me, go hand in hand. And I think what is really exciting is that there does seem to be a lot of movement towards looking at creating protective environments and really acknowledging how our environments can play such a huge role in shaping behavior, and not just like physical environments, but also our social environments. That's just an area that I think there's like exciting possibilities that I don't know that we've like completely tapped into yet. So I love that. But, Janae, I also think one thing that we've talked about on Prevent Connect web conferences and in podcasts this past year is around like the cultural climate and the impacts that that's causing prevention practitioners and prevention programming. So I'd love to get your take on that.
Oh, yeah. All good stuff. We're going to dive into all of that, and for people who are listening and might not be like super up on like public health speak, I know I am typically not a public health girly. I come from a community organizing background. When we talk about health equity, and I really want to dive into health equity, it's really just this idea that everyone has a right to a fair and just opportunity to attain their highest level of health. So that's like very basic. We all have the right to live healthy lives, both socially, physically, and emotionally. And we talk about protective environments. It's this idea that perpetrators are not born, right? Like, they're not just born bad. People are not born bad. We're shaped by our environments. And so just like things can happen in people's lives that put them at higher risk of causing harm or experiencing harm, there are also things that can protect them from doing those things. So things like supportive family, peers, and community, access to stable housing and food, knowledge about healthy sexuality. There are all of these factors that really we can impact to kind of bolster some support around people to prevent violence before it starts. And I want to talk about health equity because you're both right. While health equity, I feel like has been around, especially, Ashleigh and I in kind of like higher level theoretical spaces, I am also seeing it really catch around local organizations. And that's really cool. And it seems like people are really getting on board with this idea that it's our job to fight to eliminate injustices and health disparities. And like I said, health equity, it's been growing for a few years, and I feel like it's really gaining traction in a new way right now. So Ashleigh, I'd love to start with you. obviously you lead a huge national training project with Prevent Connect, and you are no stranger to health equity. You taught me about health equity. How have you seen conversations around health equity change in 2023?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that people have really kind of built their knowledge and capacity around health equity in the last couple of years. And now where people are is more so wanting like some really concrete examples of what it looks like in practice in violence prevention. And I think that that's exciting because we have a lot of those examples and we've been able to share those examples. The other thing that I think I've been seeing is that before we can go and try to, change systems and change our environments, we have to look at the environments that we're coming from. And so I know a lot of organizations are doing that and really looking internally to see like, how do our programs, practices, and policies create their own inequities, and what can we do to change that? And so that like reflective piece, I know that's really important to me personally, and I think that that's been important to a lot of other prevention practitioners as well.
I love that. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of intentionality as well. Whereas, our conversations around health equity, even when I joined just a couple of years ago, it was really about what health equity is from a theoretical standpoint. And there are a lot of great resources out about that, really great CDC technical packages that we'll put in the description of this podcast as well. But it does feel like people are moving from needing to be convinced that health equity is something we need to be addressing. They're like, yeah, we get that. But they're really like, okay, now how do we do that? And that's a really exciting space to be in. And I always feel so lucky. I'm like, when people ask me what I do, I'm like, it's my job to find people who are doing really cool things and uplift those things. And so I just get paid to learn all the time. And that is the best. And it's kind of happening at two different levels, right? So you and I have had conversations around health equity for a couple of years now, a few years now, the CDC has. But as we know, in the anti-sexual violence field, it takes some time to get down to local centers. And that's why I'm really excited to have Shelby here. Shelby, our audiences are so different. And so while Ashleigh and I might be focused on kind of the high level theoretical prevention, working with state and public health departments, you're the one who's making sure the work is actually getting done on the ground. What is happening with health equity in the spaces that you're in?
Yeah, it's so funny that you say that, Janae, because for the last, few years, and then years before that, working in the programs as a preventionist, as, we were peers, I feel like it's the opposite. Like, I feel like folks in community have already been doing this work. They just didn't call it health equity. And it's fed up the chain to the kind of, the more theoretical folks, and the folks at the state and the CDC level are the ones who are being like, oh, we need to go and find funding and call it this thing. But from my perspective, I feel like communities have been doing this work. They just weren't calling it things like social determinants of health, or they weren't calling it, health equity. They were saying, hey, our community has needed this, but they've been doing it. We see it in grassroots organizations too, in local communities, that they're focused on kind of these intersections that we see in the gender-based violence, anti-violence movement of, we recognize economic insecurity is a risk factor. And so economic security is a protective factor against violence. And, having a whole healthy person that's connected to healthy resources in their community is a good thing. I feel like communities have known that for a long time. It's just been now, we're seeing funding and understanding at kind of these outer layers of that, to use that public health and prevention, like the socio-ecological model, right? Like, we're seeing that kind of move. We've got some really great programs. A couple of them that come to mind right now that I spoke to recently. We have a number of folks who are working within hospitals, and they've been doing prevention work with folks there. We've got a number of folks in pilot projects in California that are looking at specifically at that economic security piece. and how they can be there for their community members as a whole person, and not just on that kind of gender-based violence or teen dating violence and consent piece, but really all those intersections that we see when we look at it through a health equity lens.
You're 1,000% right, like 1,000,000% right. The term health equity is making its way through, but the work has been there for a long time. And that reminds me a lot of a 5-part series that Prevent Connect finished earlier this year with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. And it's available at preventconnect.org for anyone who wants to listen to it or anyone who wants to check it out. And it's called Health Equity Foundations for Sexual Violence Prevention. And our first session, we did a panel on very basic how social justice issues connect to preventing sexual violence and health equity. And the number of people, and even our panelists, that said, I have never used the term health equity in my life, in my career, but we're very clearly doing all of the work, is astounding. We know that we have a language problem in the movement. It is exciting for me to see, in some ways, it doesn't matter what terms we use as long as the work is getting done. But I think it's a good sign that there is starting to be some shared language versus local programs having to convince their funders that what they're doing is actual sexual violence prevention. I do think we have some ways to go in seeing experts where they are. Prevent Connect is taking this conversation even further on our social media, and we want you to be a part of the discussion. Join in on the conversation on our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we're posting excerpts from this podcast and so many more, and asking experts, practitioners, and followers like you to share your stories and ideas. Search Prevent Connect on your social media platforms to get involved. Another piece that kind of falls in under kind of shifting into health equity, and Shelby, you talked about this a little bit with economic justice, is shifting from individual prevention to kind of more community-based approaches in the way that we prevent violence. When most people think about how you prevent sexual violence, they usually go to healthy relationships presentations, one-on-one education and awareness. And of course, those are so important, but they're such a small piece of the puzzle. Where does health equity kind of divert from those more individual approaches?
So what you're talking about, Janae, are like these really individual level prevention strategies. A lot of times they're based on like skill building or norms change or just like even awareness. And that just doesn't go far enough in changing behavior, right? Like we could have all the information in the world, and that doesn't mean that our behavior is going to reflect that knowledge. And so when we shift to more of the community level strategies, we a lot of times are thinking about environments, whether those are social environments or physical environments, where there is a larger opportunity to impact people and their behavior without them necessarily even knowing that they're being impacted, if that makes sense. So when we are able to advance health equity and kind of raise everyone's quality of life, someone is going to obviously notice that, but they might not be able to connect how that is also protecting from some of our social problems like sexual violence. But I'd love to hear Shelby with some like actual examples of that.
I think part of kind of what we were touching on earlier, part of the issue is, when we have like the healthy relationships presentations, the one-on-one education, these individual level changes, a lot of that has been tied historically to funding, right? And so it's like, these are the objectives for this funding. And because funding is so scarce in the prevention world in a lot of spaces, they're tied to doing some of these individual level changes, when community mobilization for a long time has been about engaging the whole community and really trying to take in some of these things, which is why I'm so excited it's moving in that direction from kind of these higher level spaces, because there are folks who have been really trying to, like when I talk about TA with folks, the biggest piece that I see is like relationship building and capacity building for community partners that preventionists are working with, and getting organizational and internal buy-in too from these organizations and these crisis centers that are the ones I work with mostly, like getting buy-in from them, recognizing that these relationships and looking at these different intersections of violence is violence prevention work. And I feel like the preventionists and prevention departments and some of the other champions you might see at some of these centers recognize that and the importance of that. And we see some of the most successful programs are ones that have that organizational buy-in to let folks spend their prevention time like building relationships and understanding what the community needs and how a housing crisis within their community is connected to gender-based violence prevention. And so I think it's just been a lot of the struggle for a lot of folks on the ground has been historically not having that buy-in from organizations that have funding attached to objectives and deliverables that are really high quantity of folks, like reaching a lot of community members with awareness and not necessarily that qualitative, like deep rooted kind of the direction this health equity is going, looking at all of these determinants that impact a person's life and environment and how that connects to violence prevention. So, I mean, we've got some really, really great examples. One of them I can think of is this site that we have, that English language and language access is a huge issue for folks right now. Getting connected to resources is difficult because the language and some of the resources, they don't have language access to them. And we're seeing through one of our programs, through the community mobilization approach, is really focusing on language access. There's a really cool program where they're reading a book about Valley Crisis. Is like they're doing a program where they're reading a book about some of these themes that we see in gender-based violence and domestic violence prevention, sexual violence prevention, through learning English, like English learning classes, which is incredible and so creative as a way to meet the needs of the community and also tie it back into the goal, which is, violence prevention.
Oh my gosh. Everything that you just said, Shelby, is like really touching my soul in a deep way. And I'm thinking about, so when I worked at a local program doing prevention work, was a culturally specific organization for youth. So a lot of their work, like now looking back on it, it was all about health equity, but they were doing things like helping their community get access to better healthcare and resources, focusing in on the education that the youth in their community had access to and was receiving. They also, youth in this community were having a lot of contact with the law enforcement agency in the city. So they did a lot of work on like state sanctioned violence, and, like racist practices of policing. And I just remember like learning about their programs and watching them in action and thinking like, oh, actually they're doing violence prevention, but they aren't they aren't calling it that. And they're calling us, the Rape Crisis Center, to come in and do prevention education, but they're actually doing it like far beyond what we're doing, right? And I remember being like, we should be doing that. Like, we should be supporting them, or we should be helping to bolster their activities, whether that was just through like monetary means or, showing up as community members. And instead, we were going in to like middle and high schools and doing these like little one-off presentations that we're all super familiar with. And so it was just such like a moment where, like you said, Shelby, like this work has been happening forever. And sometimes it hasn't been in our movement. And
Absolutely.
So it's exciting to see that that's being recognized, but it's also like, wow, we could have been doing a lot of this like all along, or supporting it, right? We don't always have to be the people doing it.
Yeah, Ashleigh, what you just said about that. I think it highlights some really key things for me and like things that we've seen in California and some conversations we've had in California recently, but just recognizing that this is not new work and that this work has been done for historically for a very long time. And we've seen some of these intersections with this term health equity in a number of different approaches, including like if you look at queer and trans movements historically, we see a huge intersection with recognizing the person as a whole person and how their health impacts their environments and vice versa. And so I think there's so much historical knowledge around this already that we can hone in on as preventionists moving forward and understanding these cross movement collaborations. And I think, having funding attached to it is huge because I think that's where that gatekeeping piece has been for so long, we have funding. We don't want to lose it. We got to focus in on our own stuff. We can't really collaborate. And I think that's been a structural issue that's been in place for a long time. And we're seeing some movement now across the country recognizing the importance of understanding multiple intersections of this violence and how, if we can organize and mobilize as a community and on kind of these larger levels that y'all are seeing, we can really see some huge changes in our culture and in our communities.
If you like what you hear, check out other Valor Media podcasts about ending sexual violence and advancing equity. Valor Conversations, a podcast about the collective power to prevent sexual violence in California, or Leadership Moves, a podcast that shares the stories of leaders of color who carry the legacies of those who built the movement to end sexual and domestic violence. You can find both at valor.us or wherever you listen to podcasts.
I think, something that is so cool about doing kind of more of that community mobilization and focusing on those protective environments is the creativity that we get to have as preventionists. I have always thought that preventionists are some of the most creative people that I know. When you're talking about one-on-one education or school-based education or awareness stuff, it's very much like sexual violence. This is what it is. These are healthy relationships, and that stuff's really cool. But if we're looking at the root causes of violence, so within health equity, that, violence, sexual violence exists because we have economic instability, because we have a housing crisis, because racism exists, because sexism exists, because we treat folks with different abilities, with different values of life. When you have a root that's that big, you get to be really innovative in how you do prevention. And it has been so cool to see some of the things that people are doing out there, things that I never would have thought about. And you kind of mentioned some of those with those local programs. Can you tell me about, just give me a snapshot of a few really innovative strategies that you have seen really emerge out of prevention recently?
Yeah, I can definitely talk about one of the ones I'm most excited about, I think, is this intersection of economic security. It's something that I've been super passionate about the last few years too, as a preventionist, and now moving into kind of this role with supporting programs across California. This economic justice piece, which again, I don't remember if it was Ashleigh who said it, but that octopus that has all of those other arms, obviously there's so many intersections there, even within that umbrella of economic justice. But I think one of the things I'm most excited about is this piece around organizational and internal economic justice capacity building. We're seeing a huge movement in that rape prevention education, or RPE, strategy of looking at it through a health equity lens. And in California, how that's played out, we have some organizations that are doing some incredibly important and innovative and creative work on how to sustain their programming and preventions and support their community through supporting themselves. That kind of old, put your oxygen mask on first before putting it on someone else trend is, I think, the direction a lot of folks are going with economic justice, and looking at their organizations and how they can be creative in the way that they support their programs. We've got folks looking at shorter work weeks and stipends for taking care of their health and, giving folks financial means and economic supports that are supporting them as a whole person and seeing them not just as this preventionist in the community that has all these different hats they wear every day, but as a person that has needs and these same barriers that we're trying to support the community in when it comes to, like looking at disability justice and language access and mental health supports and all these other intersections. We're seeing a lot of organizations across California that are really doing some good work looking at their internal policies and internal structure and how that may cause harm and room for growth in order to support their employees to then do this work, which is huge.
I love hearing that because that's something that we often miss. The economic justice piece of doing the work internally is maybe not so coincidentally the one that we like skip out on. When we talk about anti-racism, it's very, commonly spoken and known that in order to do work around anti-racism, you have to be doing the work within yourself first. But when it comes to economic justice, maybe because that comes with a price tag and it's not just having conversations, not that anti-racism is only about conversations. There are a lot of action steps that you need to take as well, which also includes pay equity. We expect preventionists to go out and fight for paid family leave, better pay policies, housing policies, while getting $15 an hour, $16 an hour. And that doesn't really make a lot of sense. As an organization, if your strategy is economic justice, you have to understand economic justice first. Mm-hmm. And the best way to understand it is to practice it. And also, people often forget that, especially in our local programs, staff at sexual and domestic violence agencies or other community-based organizations are also part of the community. And they're usually one of the lowest paid parts of the community. That's really, really cool to see that. And then you boost morale and you address really high turnover rates in the field. And when people stick around more, they get more invested in their community and they can start to kind of work on long-term solutions. So I'm glad to hear it's going that way.
Yeah. And that's in all of the environments too, that we're, because I think people see California, at least from other perspectives that I've heard, is like this one, like just diverse community and very progressive. And we know that that's not true across the entire state. And we do have a lot of diversity. And there's also these beautiful pockets of communities, but there's a lot of struggles in those communities too. And so we have a number of these pilot projects that are in a lot of different, very different populations. And so it's been really interesting seeing how they're implementing this programming. Like you said, when they're a part of those communities too, having some of those conversations has been interesting. I've got some grantees who have youth that are in their family that are then in their youth program. Or like one of the preventionists is leading an adult group and their aunt is in it, so it's like we're very much connected to our community. And I think it is difficult to remember that. But it's really important to put that into perspective and remember that, yes, of course, we're all a part of this community too. And so we have to look at how we're treating our staff and we have to look at them as a whole person.
Yeah. And Shelby, you are working on something pretty cool right now in regards to economic security. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super excited about it. It's like I said, it's been something I've been like personally passionate about for the last few years, is this intersection. And so probably because of that, I feel like I've wiggled my way into conversations with folks across the state about some of the work they're doing, whether they're funded or not, around this economic justice piece with internal organizations, but also how they're supporting community and some intervention pieces too. But with prevention as the focus for economic justice. And so we are working with the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence. We are working with them to create a space. We just had our first session, our first peer learning circle, and we're starting with this kind of mini series web conference, our web conference mini series, where we're looking at like part one is looking at kind of the foundations and what is economic justice and, you know, putting a name to some of those things that some folks have already been working on, like we had talked about earlier. Part two is going to be really looking at some program examples and some projects. And Ashleigh, I love our collaboration because we've worked a lot the last few months on economic justice, and I'm excited to hear kind of your take on that too. But we're working on providing some concrete examples for folks to work on implementation of that. And then part three is going to be like, where do we go from here? How do we create a space in California looking at what our California labor laws are and what our specific, you know, requirements are from our agencies in California and what that impact is on our economic justice prevention efforts. So I'm very excited about it. We'll definitely share the link in the description for this too. But yeah, thank you for highlighting that. The first session was absolutely incredible. We've got folks from all over, and some of our participants, you know, we said it was open to California, but we had some folks sneak in and try and figure out, what are we talking about over here in California? What are some of the trends that are coming up? And so it was really successful. It was really, really great.
Yeah, I know that your work is California based, but I do other peer learning circles with you all, and I know that they're kind of open if you sneak your way in, and, you know, kind of bringing economic justice to more of the national scale, which is where Prevent Connect is at. Ashleigh, you have seen some really cool economic justice projects coming up.
Yeah, I mean, so I think one thing that we are trying to do is kind of collect some of those stories and some of that work in practice. But so it's like adjacent to economic justice, but I loved recently learning about some of the work coming out of the Kansas RPE world around housing policy. And like that does really connect to economic supports and economic justice. And it was so cool to hear about an RPE funded sexual violence preventionist who like has really carved out a space in being able to influence and also support housing policy or housing justice organizers in their local community. So I really love that. I think that there's more for us to learn and to uncover. And so I am always doing this thing where I am like just Googling like cool economic justice work or cool economic justice organizations, and then trying to like learn about them and see if they're interested in connecting and talking with us. And hopefully through, you know, my very professional Google researching, we'll be able to bring some of that to Prevent Connect in 2024.
You know, I love very professional Google researching. I should put that on my resume, and people should take it seriously because of economic justice work and valuing different kinds of education. I appreciate that you shared that about Kansas, because we also have a different Prevent Connect podcast, which we will link. This is kind of partially us reflecting, partially us sharing and plugging all the cool things that are out there that we want to give people access to. We had a conversation with Gabby, who is in Kansas, about their housing justice work and what they're doing. They're working with a local coalition in Lawrence, Kansas, to kind of bolster housing policies. I'm also thinking about our friends over in Colorado. I was having a conversation with them about their economic justice work, and through their RPE program, they are funding a grassroots organization that does more economic justice work, that's been doing it for a really long time. So that was a choice from the public health department to be like, you know what, this is sexual violence prevention. I remember I was talking to Danielle with the public health department, and she said that she just cold called this organization and was like, hey, we have this funding. I feel like this is a fit. Do you want to have a conversation about it? I don't know if that's exactly how it went, but just the idea of cold calling and building those relationships was really cool. And I think we also want to have them on a Prevent Connect thing soon, but I think that they were talking about supporting local businesses as a prevention strategy, which I really, really liked. Another innovative thing that I am seeing a lot more about is greening and this idea of creating green spaces or community beautification or community-centric spaces. And, that's something that has been around for a few years, but similarly, I was on a Prevent Connect web conference and it got brought up and I saw a local program write in the chat, what is greening? Can we do that with our funding? What is that? So I would love to hear, Ashleigh, maybe from you, what has your experience been with greening? And I know Prevent Connect is working on something to kind of get people there in the next couple months.
Yeah. So we have done in the past a couple, like you said, Janae, a couple of web conferences that have focused on like the physical and built environment and specifically a bit around greening. So there is there is research that suggests that areas that have more greenery have lower rates of violence. And so one strategy could be where there is less like open space and green, whether that's trees or plants or flowers, would be to like infuse those spaces with greening. The Delta Project, CDC's Intimate Partner Violence Prevention Project, Delta Ahead, there are quite a few of those recipients who are doing greening work right now. And so we'll be excited to kind of check in with them and see what that work looks like. And then there's been some work in other areas of violence prevention. So like community violence, specifically around greening. So I think there's lessons to learn there. It's a hard one. I think so. Well, first I'll say, I think it's super exciting. I think it gets to a lot of other issues like environmental justice. But it's also like a plant doesn't grow overnight. A tree doesn't grow in a year. These are things that when we talk about prevention as a long game, we're talking about things like greening that could really be a long game. So I think there's lots to learn and lots to kind of think through. But I love the idea. I know that locally, I'm in the Sacramento area, and there are a couple of urban farms that focus on teaching community, and I think specifically youth, about like gardening and growing things. And they also connect the work that they're doing to racial justice. So again, this work is happening outside of sexual violence prevention. And it's so cool because there's these like great examples of people who are making these changes in their local communities. And so, yeah, I'm excited to learn more. I think that I love being outside. I know like what it does for me as an individual. And so I think just like learning more about the research behind it is something that like really, Shelby, you said that you've been super excited about economic justice work. And I feel the same way about greening. Like right now, that's kind of like my strategy that excites me.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to shout out to Three Sisters Gardens in Sacramento, does some really great work around that. And so, yeah, I just want to give them a shout out because they've been doing it for a long time. And yeah, like you said, I mean, it's pretty incredible too, just seeing all that they're able to accomplish and these connections they're able to make to social justice. We've been talking about it this whole time, but yeah, the connection and the intersections, it's just really cool to see an organization around that.
If you're looking for more content like this, head to PreventConnect.org. We've got tools, guides, and resources on how to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence in your community, all for free and in one easy-to-access digital space. From live web conferences and recordings to a running blog, resource library, e-learning, and online community, Prevent Connect has everything you need to implement and evaluate innovative prevention initiatives in your community. All of that and more available for free at PreventConnect.org.
we're spending a lot of time here talking about innovative strategies, emerging new strategies. And I would imagine for some people listening to this, maybe people who are newer to prevention, they're like, what the heck? I thought I work at a sexual violence or agency organization. What do you mean? I'm supposed to plant a tree? I don't understand. And I just want to validate that that's like also very, very true. So this is a part of a 2-part conversation. So in December, we will be releasing another episode kind of talking about school-based prevention and, a lot of those more like foundational prevention approaches that have existed for a long time. Those are also super, super valid. And I know that in addition to having these conversations about new ways to do things, we also need to be spending a lot of time and investing in foundational knowledge and foundational skills for new staff. So I'm particularly excited about something that we have coming up at Prevent Connect. We are going to be hosting a foundational web conference, and registration is still open, although we are filling up very, very quickly. When I checked this last time, we're almost at capacity. So for anyone who's listening to this now, this should come out at the end of November. December 5th is our foundational web conference, and I would highly recommend that you register for that, especially if you're listening to this and being like, what the actual heck? Like, should I work at a garden? I don't understand. We want to talk to you. So it's called Back to Basics. You can register at preventconnect.org. It's totally free. And if you can't make it, the recording is available. Of course, it wasn't all just cool new concepts and learning opportunities this year. Preventionists also got hit with some pretty major challenges in 2023. From staff retention to facing new, bolder backlash across the country, we had our work cut out for us. Ashleigh, Shelby, and I are diving into some of the biggest challenges of 2023 and solutions we've seen emerge across the field, as well as some of the high points of the National Sexual Assault Conference coming up in the second installment of this series. Stay tuned for part 2 of Prevention Reflections, coming out in December right here on Prevent Connect and wherever you get your podcasts. Prevent Connect is brought to you by Valor US with support from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. You can find more information about this episode along with past episodes, web conferences, and blog articles at preventconnect.org. As we work to bring you more podcasts like this one, we need your help ensuring that this podcast and others like it reaches listeners like you. Take a second to rate this podcast wherever you're listening to it. That helps us show up on main podcasting pages and reach new listeners. And of course, if you have an idea for a topic that you'd like to see us cover, reach out to us and comment on this post on our Instagram page.